Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. It was just a few years ago, during a time period I will not directly make reference to, that we celebrated the launch of the Paris apartment by Kelly Bowen. This was, due to circumstances, entirely online. So we could not be more thrilled to have all of you folks gathering here in person and on YouTube as well to celebrate this book tonight. We are here, of course, to celebrate the launch of Kelly's follow-up, The Garden of Lost Secrets, to which you may wildly applaud if you are so inclined. Based upon a remarkable true story that you'll be hearing a little bit more about this evening, this is the riveting tale of one woman's secrets lost in the chaos of war. Now, I won't take up too much of your time myself. I just have a few brief housekeeping notes before we get started. The first is that there'll be a reading from Kelly right up here, or a few words from Kelly from the podium, and then we'll be moving along to a conversation hosted by my boss, Angela Torgerson. So please do be polite to her. Following that, there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions as well. So I'll run around the space with this handheld microphone, Phil Donahue style, which is not a comment on your ability to project your voice. It just ensures that those folks watching at home can hear the questions that you ask. If you are one of those folks watching at home, please feel free to write any questions you might have into the YouTube chat, and we will put them to Kelly as time permits. The only other thing I'll instill in your brain right now is that at the very end of the event, we'll ask you all to remain in your seats for just one moment as we safely transport Kelly to a table just beside our cash desk. I'll have more thrilling details about signing procedure for you at the close of the event, but stay tuned for those. We are so grateful to Grand Central Publishing and Hachette Books Canada for helping to not only publish this book, but for making this evening possible. So much gratitude to them. And of course, to all of you for joining us here tonight. Now, your host for this evening, Angela Torgerson, is the general manager here at McNally Robinson's Grant Park location. She's a voracious reader and an avid supporter of Canadian literature. And to ensure I get paid this week, she is one of the finest people I have ever worked with, and it is an ongoing honor to work by her side. Your author this evening, Rita Award-winning writer Kelly Bowen, grew up here in Manitoba. She attended the University of Manitoba and earned a Master of Science degree in veterinary physiology and endocrinology. But it was Kelly's infatuation with history and a weakness for a good love story that led her down the path of historical romance. When she is not writing, she seizes every opportunity to explore ruins and battlefields. Currently, she lives in Winnipeg with her husband and 2 boys, all of whom are wonderfully patient with the writing process, except that is when they need a goalie for street hockey. Please join me in welcoming Kelly Bowen.
All right, thank you very much for that warm welcome, and thank you all for being here as well. I really appreciate your time and your interest in my book, and it is wonderful to be back in person for sure. I'm not actually going to read from the book itself. I always find it kind of weird reading from the book itself because in my head, my characters all have voices and they're not mine. So I'm going to skip to the author's note, which I am going to read from because it was actually my editor requested me write an author's note for this book after she had read it, dealing a little bit with some of the subject matter that's included in this book. So I am going to read that, and I think that will tie into some of the questions that we will get into. All right. When I sat down to write a story set during a war, one of the most important things that I focus on is finding and researching the real stories of those who lived through it. Those who faced tragedy and hardship with courage and resilience, survived and emerged on the other side as heroes, whether they wish to be recognized as that or not. And it is so very important that these hero stories are not forgotten, including the unspeakable cruelties and unimaginable brutalities that should never be repeated. As an author, it is often tempting to gloss over or soften the trauma and devastating details that their experiences, because evil on such a scale is often difficult to understand, much less write about. Yet as I read memoirs and listened to interviews by these real-life heroes and heroines who possess the courage to relive and recount their terrible experience in an effort to preserve history, I felt that to be any less accurate as an author would do them a great disservice. Acts of inhumane cruelty committed against babies, children, men, and women, whether at the hands of an Einsatzgruppen unit or a single Nazi soldier, have been carefully documented. In this novel, I included some of them, as told by the women whose lives inspired this story in the first place. Truus Overstegen's account of the murder of a small baby in her memoirs is real, and the tragedy had a profound, lasting impact on her, as did witnessing the execution of civilian hostages in retaliation for the death of a Nazi inspector. George Santayana is credited with saying, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." These words have been paraphrased and reiterated by many, yet they remain no less gracious and relevant as time marches on, perhaps even more so. It is my belief that history cannot be divided and sorted into palatable and unpalatable columns for selective consumption by modern audiences, but must be presented as a whole. In this novel, I have endeavored to represent the entirety of history. There.
Thanks, Kelly. So for those of you who don't know, which I think is nearly everybody, congratulations. The Garden of Lost Secrets is our #1 best-selling book this week. So when it comes out with the rest of which joins your last book, The Paris Apartment. So you have back-to-back best-selling novels.
That was excellent. The Paris Apartment stayed on the best-selling list for a few weeks above Stephen King, so I just kind of like take a screenshot of that and live that forever.
Yeah, again, not that time in the store's history, but we had The Paris Apartment just in cases, cartons, and we just pulled it and sent it out. We didn't even bother getting it on the shelves. So it's wonderful to see you.
Thank you very much.
Back at #1. So the first thing we talked about, I wanted to chat with you, was your research process. What about these Dutch resistance fighters compelled you to sort of reimagine what they went through and tell their stories in the Garden of the Lost Secrets?
So interestingly enough, as it happens, I came across the three women who inspired this story, Hani Schaft and Truus and Freddie Overstegen, three young women, schoolgirls really, who described themselves as very ordinary until they were asked to do extremely extraordinary things. And I read, in the course of my research for the Paris Apartment, I ended up reading Sophie Polderman's book about these three women. And I read the whole thing through, sat down one sitting, and when it was finished, I knew I had to move on because I still had to write the Paris Apartment, but their story stuck with me and it just didn't let go. So when it came time to write a synopsis for a new book, it was a pretty easy synopsis to write in terms of where to start. And it started with those three.
That's incredible. It's an incredible story. We've ordered the book for the store because I had not seen it on the shelves before. So you talked about how it's important that you properly represent history, that you don't gloss over some of the subject matter. Does that make it particularly hard to write certain scenes?
Really hard to write certain scenes. It's hard to listen to them. There's lots of archived information and interviews online, the Memory Project and that sort of thing that you can listen to. And it's watching these people recount their experiences in firsthand. It's really hard to listen to, and it's really hard to write because you can't, me, happy Canadian here, kind of insulated from any sort of war experience. It's hard to actually imagine what they experienced, what they went through. So tried to listen very carefully to what they had to say, to what they wrote, and represent that in my own work.
Yeah, no, that comes really clearly through. It's obviously very well researched, which makes it so interesting to read. And you've talked about your passion for exploring ruins and battlefields. were you able to travel for research for this
I
book?
was not able to travel for the research for this book due to the event that
Yes.
John so delicately
That we're avoiding talking
described. That being said, the amount of online resources, certainly that are available now, were absolutely fantastic. In the book, I use the Corrie ten Boom House in Harlem as part of one of my settings and something that my character visits. And you can visit that online. You could go home and visit it tonight. It has an incredible website. You can start at the beginning. It's a tour through all the rooms. It explains the history. So I rely pretty heavily on those resources. Google Maps, taking a tour along the streets, just kind of seeing what I couldn't see firsthand. It sounds kind of cliche and kind of corny, but super, super useful when you can't travel. My fingers did the traveling for me.
Were you able to with the Paris apartment?
Yeah, we spent some time in Paris and that was fantastic. I would love to go back there again. Normandy was extremely humbling. Loved the time that we spent there. I was able to visit the Juno Beach Center, those types of monuments and museums that have a lot of people have worked really hard to preserve that history.
So your depictions of the garden in particular, not just to steal from the title, but it was so detailed. You could picture walking through an estate like that. How much research did the gardens themselves take?
Actually, a lot of the gardens came from some of the greenery, certainly in Versailles and other places. Actually, in Scotland, I had a garden kind of pictured in my mind that was at a castle in Scotland. And I just kind of imagined walking through. When I listen to memoirs, one of the things that always strikes me is the people talk about not only what they saw or what they heard, but what they smelt or what they felt or the feeling of the sun or what they could, their entire experience, not just kind of numbers or labels or lists of things that are saw. And I try to make sure that when I write, whether it's about a garden or a different type of experience, I try to make sure I incorporate that as well.
No, the gardens are so, as you guys read the book, the gardens are just gorgeous and they make you want to walk through France. And yeah. So I guess my next question would be, in every historical fiction book, there's often an element, just to get off the heavy stuff for a second, of love or romantic entanglement. How do you weave that through in your writing process against sort of the harder topics? How important that is to your moving ahead of the storyline?
That kind of, whether it's a romance or even a close relationship between friends or sisters or anything, I mean, that's ultimately what binds people, right? That's ultimately the story. That's the guts of the story. So kind of in terms of weaving it through like the facts and the history and the dates and the times and all of the stuff that happened around that, it's more of a kind of crafting how those dates and times and actions impacted those relationships and how those relationships changed and came out differently on the other side of all of that.
Yeah, and a lot of your female characters are so in both the Paris apartment and the Garden of Lost Secrets. There seems to be a real strong theme of really, really strong, empowered women who are able to manage to move ahead in just the worst circumstances.
Yeah, I love stories of strong women. They're a little harder to find in the history books than stories of strong men, but they exist. Even in my historical romances, every single heroine is based on a real person, whether it was the first woman to apply to Harvard Medical School or whether it was the first woman to run a steel mill. They're all based on real people. And like I said, they're a little harder to find. And it's funny because every once in a while, not so much with historical romance, or with historical fiction, with my historical romances, I get emails from readers saying, well, I don't really find that realistic. No woman back then would ever have wanted to do that, or would have acted that way, or would have done that. And it's I kind of call it the Jane Austen effect a little bit, because if Keira Knightley didn't star in it, then period, it didn't happen. But yeah, if you just do a little more digging, there are some phenomenal stories. For myself, I went to university, got a master's degree in science. That didn't happen by accident. 200 years ago, I couldn't have done that. Somebody came before me to make that possible, for me just to do it without thinking twice about it. So those are the women that I try to find and try to incorporate them in my stories.
If you actually go to Kelly's website, kellybowen.com, I think it is.
.net.
.net. I just discovered all of the list of her characters and inspirations behind them. And it's a really interesting list of powerful women. So it's worth checking out. But that leads me to my next question was, you started in historical romance. Is that a genre? What's the difference in your approach to writing a historical romance novel versus more historical fiction like set in?
The approach so much isn't different. Both books are still about relationships. With historical fiction, there's a little bit more leeway to expand those relationships to not just a romantic type relationship. Sisters, friends, strangers that meet, unlikely partners, that sort of thing. But ultimately, like I said before, those relationships are the guts of the book, and they're what drive the story.
Is one more fun to write than the other?
I don't know if it would be more fun, just slightly different. I still like to weave a little bit of a love story through each of my historical fictions. I just finished my next one, actually I just finished it this afternoon. And it has a little bit more, even more of a little bit of a love story in terms of kind of a woman finding herself, deciding what it is, who she wants to be through different circumstances or different conflicts.
Is historical romance a genre you'd consider going back to?
Oh, for sure.
Amazing. Yeah.
They're fun to write. It is. Anytime you get to take history and write a fun fictional story, and you get to kind of, when you're watching a movie and it's really good, and then something happens and it goes this way, and you want to throw something at the TV and say, no, why didn't that happen? When you're writing a book, you can make that happen. That's the best part of it.
Yeah, no, especially knowing now what you base your characters of your historical romance novels on. I want to go back and read some more of them. So they continue to sell, and their romance is one of the fastest growing genres in the store. So it's exciting for us to see that those characters come from places like that, not just the lady hunting the earl or.
Yeah, no, I'm not a shrinking violet person. I can't do it. I won't touch.
Speaking of, one of the other themes that go along with strong women in your books are those female relationships and drawing strength, whether it be from a grandparent or a great grandparent or a sister. How do you find that as an important theme in your books?
I think just in terms of what I use it is just tying generations together, sort of to paint a picture of what happened in one generation and kind of the impacts or how it might have changed the next generation and the next generation from there. Everybody has a story. Everybody's ancestors came from somewhere, did something, got through something. And it's just, I find it fascinating how future generations then can build on that and the directions that they go.
Yeah, I thought the relationship in the Garden of Lost Secrets between the two sisters being a little bit estranged, which is in the beginning, I'm not giving you any spoilers. It rang really true to completely different women or completely different paths from the same background. So it was interesting to see, like, did you have it in your head that they would come together? Did you sort of have that pictured, or were you more comfortable leaving them a little bit separate in their?
No, I always wanted them to come together. I have a sister who I am extremely close with. She's my best friend. And I couldn't imagine us being this way. And even though we don't live anywhere near each other, we're always coming back together for all sorts of things. And it's just, I couldn't do that to my characters. They needed to come back together. And it was just, and that was a way to use a previous generation, so their great grandmother, who they really knew nothing about, or nothing about her history or her story, to bring that back together. And it's interesting, after I wrote The Paris Apartment, I took part in a lot of book clubs, and it was just absolutely fascinating. the number of people who said to me, I had a great aunt, I had a grandmother, I had a great grandmother, and we didn't even know she served in the Pacific Fleet or here or there until she passed and we went through her things. We didn't even know she served, much less did the things that she did. And it was wild to me to think of how many secrets these women have kept, that they haven't looked back, and they've just kept going forward.
Yeah, that actually leads to another question of mine, which was, you mentioned that briefly in your author's note, but you were also compelled to sort of explore the themes or the idea of how you rebuild after going through such an experience, how you pick up the pieces after seeing, the worst of human interactions, and where you go forward with that. So do you think that a lot of that secrets and families come from wanting to protect future generations, or not being able to speak about it because no one did?
Probably both, depending on the people. I know, listening to the interviews, how difficult it is for people to speak of those things 50, 60 years later. I can't imagine how difficult it might have been to speak of those things 2 or 3 years later. So yeah, they've kind of, for a lot of people, they just seem to have put it over here and gone forward. They haven't let it, it certainly changed them, but they haven't let it limit them, I think was the message that I got from a lot of the interviews that I watched.
So do you think, like in present day, with things like with our knowledge of PTSD and dealing with trauma, do you think future generations will be far more open to talking about their experiences with similar things?
I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope so. I mentioned it in this book a little bit at the very beginning. The experience that one of my characters has, his father, of course, a survivor of the First World War, and just in terms of how people were treated, and we didn't want to talk about it, and we just shuffled it over here and hoped it all went away. And of course, it never really goes away. And it's always something that kind of holds, certainly it held him back.
Yeah. And then one of the other parts that I really enjoyed, that I found interesting about, you don't see a lot in historical fiction, is you sort of weave not quite a fairy tale, but it's pretty close throughout the book. Was that intentional? Was that part of your plan from the beginning?
For sure. With the Paris apartment, I use a lot of art and art history to kind of, in terms of symbolism and telling a story. With this one, I used fairy tales. It seemed to fit with certainly the main character and her love of writing and her love of fairy tales, and also kind of her character arc where she starts as, and everything's kind of sunshine and roses, and she's super optimistic about everything, and then she experiences the worst that humanity has to offer, and how her view of the world changes, how she weathers that, and how she comes out on the other side.
It also dramatically changes her view of herself, which I found really interesting. Do you think that's partly why you placed her in that position where she never passed that on to the people she knew?
I think so. Yeah. I don't think she wanted the same cynicism or bitterness that she experienced to pass on to future generations.
So in the Paris apartment, you mentioned using the art and the history to weave through. With the Garden of Lost Secrets, you get really technical when one of the characters is off in the Navy and then the Air Force. Was the military history side of that really, was it difficult to write? Was it difficult to research?
Not really, I love that. I love the technical side of it. So in terms of the sinking of the French fleet in French Algeria, I hadn't actually known about that until I sat down and started writing it, where the British sunk the French fleet, the entire French fleet, so that they wouldn't fall into German hands. And the debate about why they did it and the repercussions of that is still ongoing. You can go into forums and there are still people really actively debating the whys and the hows and the what ifs. And it was absolutely fascinating. But so the research part of that is one of the best parts of this job. I loved it. The technical part, my editor actually took a lot of the technical part out. Don't think your readers really need to know this. Okay, that might have been a little overboard, no pun intended, but yeah. So taking a little bit of that out to make just so that it doesn't distract from the story itself. But if you need to know anything about the Britannia, I can answer questions.
Please do. That was a really interesting part, actually. I felt like I could actually picture what it would be like to work in some of those machine rooms, and yeah, not having any real background on what a ship would look like there. There's another scene later on, without spoiling anything, where one of the characters' rooms is broken into.
Yes.
And I was surprised to hear that that was an accurate account too.
Yes, so that was one of the main characters during his jetbird training, and I came across that in a biography, No Bridges Blown, and he talked a little bit about his time in Scotland during training, and while he was sleeping in his room one night, a woman broke in through the window, and she was tasked with stealing something, doing something to prove that she'd been there, probably because there was a spy school a couple miles up the road where they were training women finally to get into the war. And so I thought, it's a cool story, I'm going to use that.
I love that, actually. I would loved it even more when I found out it was real. So what's next for you? You said you just finished a book.
I just finished a book today.
Mhm.
It finally died. I've been telling my family that it's going to be done today for the last 8 days, but it is finally finished. The first draft anyways. I don't think a book's ever really finished, but this one is in the course of my research for this book, which you're reading the historical note. We're going back to Libya, to North Africa, to the campaign there. And the book is inspired by Susan Travers, who was an English woman, the only woman to join the French Foreign Legion. And she was a driver for the French general. And she actually broke him out of Bir Hakeim when the Germans had it surrounded. She drove him out under heavy gunfire, hand-to-hand fighting, after being besieged for almost 2 weeks in the desert. It's a pretty cool story. Anyways, that's what's next.
To be the next best-selling book from Kelly Bowen.
And
And so that's like one of my final questions, actually, is when you're writing, is that like, how strict are you? Do you start writing right at 9 and write until 5? Do you write as it hits you, or
yeah,
in a fevered?
I try to keep it fairly structured because it would be easy just to wander away and do other things. It's nice. It's a fantastic job because it is flexible. Closer to deadline time, probably not as flexible. I should probably do better at that, but yeah, I try to treat it like a very normal job. I coach and I do other things outside of that. So it's been wonderful to allow me the flexibility to do that.
That's awesome. John, we will open the floor to questions now.
Absolutely. So just a reminder that if you do have a question, just put up your hand and I'll get to you. And if you are watching online, just write it in the chat. We'll put it to Kelly. Are there any questions here in the space?
And feel free to ask me questions about anything. It doesn't have to be about this book because probably most of you haven't read it yet. But if you want to have questions about the writing process or anything, publishing.
If you could pick any time period to set a historical romance, which time period would it be?
I'm glad you asked that question. The first historical romance that I wrote was set during the Crusades, the second one to be specific. I've also written one during the Tudor times. Actually, I've written 3 during the Tudor times, Age of Exploration, High Seas, super cool. I've also written one set in New France, so early Canada, mail order brides. How could you go wrong with a romance? My editors have very nicely patted me on the head and said, that doesn't sell. Can you please write us things that do sell? So I have. But once I become a best-selling author and I top Stephen King on the things all the time, then I will write books set there during those 3 time periods. So those are my favorite.
I think I would love to read Mail or a Bride. Yeah,
Right.
Okay, follow up to that then. Have you ever written about the King's Daughters time period, the Idyllic?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Okay.
Mail order brides. Yes, it's such a cool period of history and almost nobody knows about it.
Yeah, I actually am descended from that, so I'd really like to read it, yeah.
Okay, I would like to interview you.
And were there any other questions at all?
I have a question. Your publisher is an American publisher.
Yes.
Were they more responsive to the historical romance genre, or did you just feel just that's where your agent took you?
No, it was a conversation that I had with my editor. I've had the same editor since my very first historical romance. She's fantastic. I had written a number of romance series for her, and during one of our conversations at dinner, I said, I'd love to write a historical fiction, a World War II set. And she said, write me a synopsis. And so I did, and she was like, let's do this. So it was honestly, it sounds ridiculous, but it was that simple in terms of pitching her the idea. And she said, yeah, there's probably a little bit of luck, right place, right time. There's certainly a larger market opening up for World War II set books. So she was like, yeah, this is something we can sell. So go ahead and write that.
Given your background in science, actually, have you ever considered writing, weaving that into a fiction novel?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting.
Do you ever struggle with writer's block, and if so, how do you work around that?
Yeah, for sure. There's lots of times where I get to the end of a scene and I have no idea what happens next, not a hot clue. But the good news is that I know what happens way over here in chapter 27. So I just go on and start writing. I just leave it, don't worry about it, and just go on writing somewhere else. Quite often I have to go back and rewrite a bunch of stuff because I get way ahead of myself, or I have to change things later. But yeah, I just start writing about something else if I get stuck in a certain spot. That's what works for me. Other authors I know go for runs, or they do other things. That there's no right or wrong way to do any, there's no right or wrong way to write at all. But that's what I do when I get to a spot where I don't know what comes next.
I'd like to know a little bit more about the veterinary line, and is there a book coming out with that trend in it?
Well, I don't have anything planned. Certainly my historical romances, I can write with some authority about chickens and horses. My degrees are so very useful. I used to be a research scientist for Maple Leaf Foods, is what I used to do before I started writing books. And I loved my job. I was in the barns. It was absolutely fantastic. But I've started writing books, and I haven't gone back to agriculture yet. Never say never. I miss it. But I'm having a lot of fun writing books too. So I'll try to work some more pigs in some.
Hi, Kelly. I'm curious, just starting to learn about you as an author, read your Paris apartment book, but how did you make the transition from being in the science world to an author?
Being a what, sorry?
In the science world to an author.
Good question. I don't know if it was so much of a transition. I guess it was a transition. It's kind of a painful transition, actually, if I think about it. I've always loved art and writing and reading. That's kind of hard to, it's always a nice break from my job. It was all science and statistics, and I love that too, because it's real numbers and puzzles that have answers. But on that side, in terms of writing and being creative, when I had my first child, I was home and I was no longer solving fun statistical puzzles. So I had a lot of time on my hands, and I was reading a lot, and there was a lot of books and movies, like I said before, where you got to a part in the book and you went, why? Close the book. So I thought, well, I should just write my own. So I did write one, and it was awful, like really bad. It was terrible. It was 110,000 words. It was awful. We'll never see the light of day again. And then I wrote 5 more. And it was my 5th one that I ended up throwing in a contest, just the first 50 pages. And my agent that I have now is actually one of the judges of the contest. And she said, oh, she said, this is really great. She said, can you send me the rest? Yes. I'm so excited. She read it and she said, I really like your voice. This is a really good story. She said, now can you write me something that I can actually sell? I said, and what would it be? She said, I need a full novel and a synopsis for 2 more because it has to be a series. Set during Regency, England would work, Scotland would work. I was like, oh, okay. So I did, and I haven't looked back since then.
I think to go back to where you said, you know, the why when you're reading some of these novels, I find that with yours, you don't get to that point. There's no cliched, you know, the girl is making the wrong choice, but she's doing it for the right reasons moment where you just want to cringe for making educated, informed decisions and taking charge of their own lives, which comes back to that whole theme of stronger women that you're writing, which is really fresh. Yeah.
Well, thank you. But again, in terms of readers, I mean, I've written my book and it's up to you guys to like, to not like. I've done my job. I don't expect everyone to love it. It's actually a little bit of a relief when someone says, oh, I really loved this book of yours and I didn't like this one as much. Because it tells me I didn't write the same book twice. So it's a little bit of a relief when I hear someone say that, as weird as that sounds. But yeah, it's just, I just want to share stories and it's up to readers to enjoy them or to seek out other stories that appeal to them more.
Were there any further questions held here? All right, well, if there's nothing forthcoming, I'll turn things over to you folks for any closing comments you might have, and then I'll be back to go over signing procedure.
Closing comments. Thank you again for taking time out of your really busy schedules and your busy lives to be here for this. I really appreciate it. And thank you to you guys as well for hosting. And thank you again for reading this book. There is a lot of really fantastic books out there. And certainly as an author, I recognize and appreciate the time that you spend reading my book. It really means a lot to any author. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for coming. And it means a lot to us to have you in our writing community. Before any of you leave, you should really come up and take a look at some of the titles that you've brought. These are some of the international covers, and they're just stunning. So they're definitely worth a look. There's some really different ones here than the Canadian releases. But thanks, that was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
And thanks for being #1 on our bestseller list this week.
And if anyone can read Hungarian, Czechoslovakian, Spanish, or Swedish, let me know because I can't. It's pretty wild flipping through your book and when I wrote this and I have no idea what these words mean. But yeah, so just let me know.
Thank you so much, both of you. So we'll now move along to the signing portion of the evening. So I'll ask you all to remain in space for just one moment while we transport Kelly to the signing table. At that point, you'll be able to come over and have a copy of the book signed. Please note there are copies at our cash desk. There are copies on the signing table. There are likely copies in your hands. So please do feel free to have a copy of the book signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for the book before you leave the store. And otherwise, thank you all again so very much for coming, for your attention, for your questions as well. It's wonderful to be here and to celebrate this book, The Garden of Lost Secrets. So thank you to Hachette Books Canada, to Grand Central Publishing, to our host, Angela Torgerson, who I am obliged to thank very profusely at this point. And please join me one final time in acknowledging Kelly Bowen. Thank you all so much.